Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are located. We're going to start with the second iteration of our North Korea Beyond the Six Parties event, jointly co-organized by Stimson and 38 North, together with the KF-VUB Korea Chair and the Brussels School of Governance. My name is Ramon Pacheco Pardo, and I'm going to be your host today. And in the second iteration of this event, we're going to be looking at ties between North Korea and Central Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Three regions that are usually underexplored in terms of the relations with North Korea and on which we're going to be focusing on. And to do this, I have a stellar panel with 4 experts coming from different parts of the world. So I'm going to start by introducing them. We have Camilo Aguirre Torrini, who is a doctoral researcher at the University of Sussex, and who is also an associate researcher at the Centro de Estudios Comparados de Corea in the Universidad Central de Chile, and he's actually joining us from Santiago. We also have Dr. Virginie Grelzik, who is a reader or associate professor in international relations, and also head of a School of Social Sciences and Humanities at Aston University in the UK. We also have Dr. Ho-Yoon Ko, who is an assistant professor in political science and international relations at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan, who is joining us today actually from Korea. And we also have Jenny Town, who you all know. She hosted the first iteration of this event. She's a senior fellow at the Stimson Center and also director of the 38 North program. In my case, my name is Ramon Pacheco Pardo. I hold the KF-VUB Korea Chair. I'm also a reader in international relations at King's College London. So without any further ado, we're going to start this event by looking at relations between North Korea and Central Asia. So Ho-Yoon is going to be talking for 6-7 minutes to introduce the relationship between this region, Central Asia, and North Korea. Ho-Yoon, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for having me today. So I'm going to present about the relationship between North Korea and Central Asia, but mostly focus on relationship between North Korea and Kazakhstan because I'm working and teaching in Kazakhstan. And I also believe that many aspects of the relationships are pretty similar across all those 5 Central Asian countries vis-a-vis North Korea. Well, Central Asian countries are mostly known for post-Soviet countries because all those 5 countries are independent after the collapse of Soviet Union. Well, despite both North Korea and Central Asian countries share the experience of communism, the current foreign relations of North Korea with Central Asia are pretty limited, I have to say. So I will have about 3 main points to share with you today. First, well, again, North Korea has lost its ground in political, economic, and strategic relations with Central Asia in general. Well, in case of Kazakhstan, the diplomatic relations with North Korea was first set up back in 1992. And North Korean embassy was set up and operational in the capital city of Kazakhstan until 1998. But after 1998, North Korea doesn't have any official representative in Kazakhstan. Well, a simple explanation for this discontinuation is the competition between North and South Koreas. Well, for Kazakhstan, South Korea is way more important country than North Korea is. And South Korea is the 3rd largest economy for Kazakhstan's import, only next to Russia and China. And also in export, South Korea is the 2nd largest destination in Asian countries, again, next to China. Well, on the other hand, Kazakhstan finds little interest in its relationship with Pyongyang. For example, the trade volume between 2 countries are nearly 0. In 2018, I think, it's 2018, reported volume of trade was only about $200,000, so which is nearly nothing compared to the amount of South. Well, also Astana, Kazakhstan did not revoke the official relationship with Pyongyang, but it is true that the balance of interest between two Koreas and Kazakhstan has been tilted in favor of South Korea. Another example is international pressure on North Korea. Well, because of North Korea has violated several times about the international agreement about missile test and freeze of a nuclear test, there are some pressures made on those countries. So for example, around 2015, Kazakhstan agreed to reopen the North Korean embassy in Astana. However, North Korea's nuclear test in the following year and also the international sanctions made the circumstances less favorable. And also the last North Korean embassy in Tashkent, Uzbekistan was also closed in 2016 after the nuclear test. Reports said that the discontinuation or closure of those embassies were by the request of the hosting countries, not by North Korea. So this tells what the circumstances were like. And still today, no official exchanges or diplomatic interactions are happening between Central Asian countries and North Korea. And my second point is, well, given this dormant relationship with North Korea at the official level, North Korea seems to remain interested in economic investment from or through Central Asian countries. One of the key factors of such a desire is the large population of Korean ethnics in the region. About 0.3 Soviet Koreans are living in Central Asia, mainly Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And those Korean diaspora were playing the key role in connecting North Korea and the region in the past. Well, however, after the 1990s, South Korea strategically and aggressively built connection with those Soviet Koreans in the region using multiple policy tools, including repatriation and a lot of subsidies for that, and also public diplomacy and sometimes nationalist appeal and propaganda. In the 2000s, Pyongyang encouraged the Soviet Koreans in the region to invest in North Korea, in fact. For example, it was once circulated among the Korean community in Kazakhstan that foreign companies that are registered and operational in Kazakhstan, they could open branches in North Korea with a minimum paperwork. And also Korean Kazakhs or anyone with a legal residency in Kazakhstan, they also could apply and get North Korean visa without much difficulties, because those are usually very difficult to get otherwise. Again, however, recently, tight sanctions in North Korea and the pandemic situation, nothing is actually happening at official or unofficial level in terms of human exchange or any interactions. My last point is, well, despite the long-standing difficulties and restraints on the bilateral tie between North Korea and Central Asia, well, the shared experience of communism and authoritarian regime could be an interesting reference for the future of North Korea, I think, in many aspects. For example, social changes, progresses, economic reforms, foreign policies, and in case of Kazakhstan, the nuclear issue, the denuclearization. For instance, having been under long-time influence of Russia, Kazakhstan also struggled with finding ways to survive and prosper amid great power games in the region. And I think it's noticeable that Kazakhstan, as a former Soviet republic, has been proactively seeking diplomatic ties with the US and European countries since its very independence. So this so-called multi-vector diplomacy allowed Kazakhstan to maintain its regime and secure its security, and even to earn some economic profits. So I guess that some possible connections are still alive if North Korea is willing to address. Well, to sum up, the current status of North Korea and Central Asia relations is close to zero. Nonetheless, I think there are some potential points of contact and shared experiences for the future of North Korea and the relationship with North Korea. Yeah, that's it from me.
Thank you very much. We're looking at those potentials later on. We're going to move on to Latin America now. Camilo, please go ahead with your initial presentation.
Okay. Good morning. First, I would like to thank the Stimson Center for organizing this online event and Dr. Ramon Pacheco for inviting me. He invited me to speak about the relationship between North Korea and Latin America. So I'll begin by examining what we know about this relationship, and then I'll fill in the gaps. Finally, in my second intervention, I'll focus on a case study, North Korea and Chile. A brief clarification, I will focus on the diplomatic relations and transnational exchanges between the DPRK and Latin American countries, but I will not deal with guerrilla export activities for lack of time. These are well documented in Joseph Bermuda's Terrorism, the North Korean Connection, and Benjamin Young's Guns, Guerrillas, and the Great Leader, North Korea and the Third World. That said, what do we know about North Korea and Latin America? I'll start by saying that this is a very obscure subject. I don't know if it's because of the language barrier or a mere lack of interest, but the fact is that North Korea's presence in the region has been systematically ignored in the historical accounts produced here, even by more recent ones that emphasize the importance of their actors in the development of a global Cold War. Therefore, the best sources of information available to the public are the two scholarly works previously mentioned and the website North Korea in the World, a joint project of the East-West Center and the National Committee on North Korea. This website tells us that Cuba was the first Latin American country to establish bilateral relations with the DPRK in 1960, just 1 year after the Cuban Revolution. After Cuba, the DPRK established bilateral relations with Chile in 1972, Argentina in 1973, Venezuela in 1974, Nicaragua in 1979, and Mexico in 1980. Towards the end of the Cold War, the DPRK established bilateral relations with Peru and Colombia in 1988, and finally with Brazil in 2001 and Guatemala in 2007. What is interesting to note here is that we have three different waves with very long intervals between them. My reading is that the 12-year period between the establishment of bilateral relations with Cuba and the establishment of relations with Chile reflects the anti-communist stance of Latin American governments during the early year of the Cold War and the influence of the United States that financed those governments through the Alliance for Progress, this hoping to avoid a second Cuba. It was precisely the emergence of socialist projects in Latin America during the Cold War that allowed the DPRK to spread throughout the Western Hemisphere during the early 1970s. The second gap represents the rise of anti-communist dictatorships in Latin America during the 1970s and 1980s. With the end of the Cold War, relaxation and democratization processes allowed other countries such as Peru and Colombia to move closer to the DPRK. Finally, the Latin American pink tide or left turn of the early 21st century provided an enormous opportunity for North Korea to expand its influence in the region. It was precisely in this context that bilateral relations with Brazil were established. This was followed by the opening of a North Korean embassy in Brazil and a Brazilian embassy in Pyongyang. However, this pink tide was followed by a shift to the right that cooled any prospects of strengthening relations. The nail in the coffin was the US request to Latin American countries to cut ties with North Korea during the sixth nuclear test in 2017. The only country where the DPRK could prosper was Venezuela. Both countries faced with economic sanctions moved close together, and recently, in 2019, Venezuela opened its embassy in Pyongyang. So far, I have tried to develop a coherent narrative based primarily on the data that's available on the North Korea and the World website, but putting that data in context. While extremely helpful, this website focuses too much on official dates, and in doing so, cannot capture the true nature of the DPRK public diplomacy approach. My research on Chile and North Korea has allowed me to see the establishment of bilateral relations not as a spontaneous event or an inevitable choice for socialist countries in the region, but as the result of a long-term relationship that was developed by rich transnational exchanges that involved non-state actors in Latin America and that was built around solidarity and shared views on economic development and anti-imperialism. In my second interview, I will focus on the Chilean case to show how the establishment of bilateral relations was precisely the product of such exchanges. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, later on we'll have the opportunity to dig deeper on Chile, potentially in other countries as well. Virginie, we move to Sub-Saharan Africa. So if you want to please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you everyone for organizing this. I'm very happy to join and share a little bit of the work that I've done on Africa and the DPRK. So what's quite interesting about the DPRK's approach to extending its foreign policy is that this was really done in the context of its relationship with South Korea as well. So both Koreas played the same kind of game during the Cold War, especially in the 1950s and 1960s, in trying to actually secure relationship with the rest of the world in order to try to gain influence. What is quite interesting is they were playing also this game whereby, you know, if one country was choosing to have a relationship with one Korea, then they wouldn't be able to have a relationship with the others. So time was of the essence in a way to try to secure those relationships. So during that time, the DPRK was attractive to a number of countries because it actually had solid economic performance, especially because of some Japanese modernization and investment and infrastructure that happened during the colonization. So what it meant is that in the 1950s and early 60s, the DPRK, economically speaking, was ahead of South Korea. So there was, you know, that kind of element. So what it meant is that it was actually quite interesting for newly decolonized countries, such as countries in Africa, to actually partner to some extent with the DPRK. Those countries were also committed to independence, which was a very important, you know, topic for the DPRK, coming from, you know, colonization experience itself as well. So what's quite interesting is that the relationship with countries in Africa have become crystallized and become important around export. So essentially grounds for the DPRK to export some of its military equipment, trade as well. Where, you know, the DPRK received some agricultural goods and some other things that they were not able to produce themselves. And they have also slowly evolved towards illicit relationship, where we've seen a lot of smuggling opportunities and a lot of, you know, illicit trading in gold and a number of other things. And that is these days what is really the focus, especially of you know, the latest panel of expert report that we got, you know, early March around illicit information, illicit activities. So if we kind of backtrack around this Africa pursuit, really, what's quite interesting is you know, Africa was in a way I was going to say a little bit more of a neutral kind of region for the DPRK. You know, Central Asia, as we just, you know, have seen, was really, you know, quite focused with Russia. You know, in Latin America, there was quite a lot of American influence as well. And actually, in Africa, some of the influence was around Europe, but there were very small links between Europe and the DPRK anyway. So this was kind of like an area that could be explored. And also it was far enough not to intervene directly in the type of relationship the DPRK was developing around the region, especially about when it comes to the relationship with the RK as well. So it was also a very good match because, you know, you could have an exchange of you know, military goods versus agricultural goods, and also it was an opportunity for the DPRK to help as well. So we've seen some engagement that was around supporting ideology, supporting various independence movements in various parts of Africa, but also supporting a kind of non-Western slant, which was quite important for the DPRK as well. It was definitely against Seoul, and it was also about generating an image of the DPRK as a potential modern or beacon of the third world. And, you know, Benjamin Young has talked about it quite a bit. So it's quite interesting along those lines. So if we have a look at you know, the countries, the bulk of the relationship really developed in the late 1950s and 1960s, with the first relationship, I think it was in 1958 with, I think it was Guinea. And then after that, you have quite a lot of relationships that develop, some that are going to become more extensive than others. And one we will look at a little bit more in detail later on is the relationship with Uganda, that actually fits both in terms of intense diplomatic relationship, but also military training, and a very, very important and sustained relationship over decades, even though there were many coups within Uganda and regime changed, but the DPRK was a constant in providing military goods and also some training. So what we've seen in terms of provision of those goods is, initial trade whereby the DPRK sold a number of its second-hand equipment. So essentially the equipment that it had received during the Cold War by China. So it's possible to trace those. If we want to talk a little bit about, I think looking at evidence is actually very important here. Like what are the type of sources that we can have a look at, looking at CIPRI, looking at, the kind of trade register that we have with the UN. It's very interesting because you're actually able to trace MiG-17s and all of that, and when they were sold and when they arrived and all of that. There's quite a lot of evidence in terms of data around trade, because those things were not restricted then, they were not outlawed. They became outlawed later on when we started to have a UN regime of sanctions, and they are now quite important because of the sanctions, especially since 2017. We can also have a look at other types of activities that went across with the DPRK sending contractors and building a number of monuments through the Mansonde overseas project, but also building some more functional buildings, police stations and all of that. And so what we see is actually two types of activities: the military product and the trade, and then contractors. So none of what we were talking before, with what would have happened in Central Asia with a large diaspora or anything. And what is quite interesting is also in some areas a little bit of difficulty knowing which Korea is doing what. So I was in Tanzania a couple of years ago for a project on health workers, because there's quite a lot of health investment in Tanzania from South Korea, but also from the DPRK, and so you see those relationships quite far away. So it's quite interesting. So I'll just stop here with just one last thought in light of the sanctions, because we are now in a question of, so now what? Because a lot of countries that were heavily involved with DPRK in various parts of Africa have turned away from the relationship because they had to, because of the sanction regime. So you had, those who were basically trying to comply, and then others who are not necessarily complying and still going on with illicit relationship. And I think this is, essentially where we are now. We are now in a system where it's not so much government, but actually subcontractors and various companies disguised doing some things. And I'm sure this is going to go back in the discussion as well. Thank you.
Thanks to you. And as you said, we'll have a discussion later on, including with the audience. Before doing so, we have Jenny, who is actually going to be focusing on the key trends in North Korea's relations beyond the six parties, which is the purpose of the event today and the previous one we had. Jenny, please go ahead.
Thanks, Ramon. Yeah, I think too often discourse on North Korea really fixates on the role of the six-party countries, and especially China, when it comes to the economic strategy and the economic importance. But as you can see, over the past two sessions that we've had, North Korea's relations with countries beyond the six parties play a really important role in North Korea's foreign policy and their economic strategy and their ability to mitigate sanctions, as well as evade sanctions. So, this is how they survive. This is their survival strategy. And so understanding these relationships is incredibly important to understanding and to crafting policies that can be more effective when dealing with North Korea. I think a lot of the major themes that we see throughout these countries is that, they do have shared historical relations and shared values. And I think, we've heard several instances today where, the idea is these are either post-Soviet, post-communist countries, or anti-imperialist. So now they have, similar enemies or adversaries along the way. And so they find these points of contention and really know how to exploit, how to develop, how to cultivate these relationships at the right times. And I think the other thing you see is that even if, this whole competition between North Korea and South Korea in terms of forming relations, it really was one of the factors in the past. I think that impulse has really diminished over the years, where a country can have relations with both Koreas and productive relationships with them. But I think what you see with the North Koreans too is that, you can always come back. So there are times where the relations were good, then, the country developed relations with South Korea, North Korea went away. And then again, when the time was right, they came back and really started to cultivate that relationship again. So there's no forever enemies in the North Korean calculus, but it's much more functional and pragmatic. I think the other themes that you see here is obviously a lot of these relationships are very hard to track down and hard to really identify the full scope and full nature of it. We're not necessarily dealing with state-to-state actors, we're dealing with individuals within countries, and countries that aren't necessarily as meticulous about reporting everything. And so, it's always like when you're looking at like Chinese customs data or Russian customs data, you always have to question, well, this is what they've reported officially. How much is being done that isn't reported? And I think several of the countries in these other regions as well follow similar practices. Not everything is going to necessarily be on the books. And not everything is going to necessarily be noticed. And it would be interesting to see more too, how many of the countries that North Korea has the best relationships with don't report. And so especially with the UN panel of experts, this is all voluntary reporting, and several countries are uncooperative. So I think, it's important to keep in mind that North Korea does have several economic and military cooperation agreements with a number of these countries. And while this amounts to, very small levels of trade and activities and relatively small economic opportunities, again, when it comes to a country with the GDP the size of North Korea, every little bit counts. And these are all things that also can be developed in the short term and create tangible benefits in the short term versus longer term strategies for bigger benefits, like with the US or South Korea. And I think, the other way that these are important, and the other reason why this is important is, these countries provide spaces for North Korea to operate, where not everything is going to be so obvious either, where it's actually sending goods back to Pyongyang to then be tracked, or sending goods from Pyongyang to these countries. But in the case of, for instance, Africa, a lot of it is contract workers. There's a lot of barter trade that goes on. There's a lot of, physical, trading and paying for things in gold. And things that may not necessarily even get back to Pyongyang, but continue to be procured and then traded within outside external spaces. And certainly the cryptocurrencies and the cyber world makes a lot of this easier as well, and operating again in external spaces to do some of these other operations. I did think it was really interesting, the point that Ho-Yoon brought up about Kazakhstan and Kazakhstan's nuclear experience and nuclear history. And I do think, there are examples. I think the denuclearization process does provide some instruction for what a denuclearization process for North Korea could look like. There are certain kind of phasing of it and certain pieces of it that could be extracted and portable to a North Korea case. I think the difference, though, is that, you know, that the values are not aligned. And I look at it this way of like, if you look at countries that have denuclearized, and, you know, South Africa is one of the big examples that people use, where it's a country that independently developed nuclear weapons and then independently chose to relinquish them. And in that decision-making process, you had, you know, a new leader who came in who was anti-nuclear himself. You also had a transition of government from apartheid government to democratic government, and then you had US security guarantees, and similar to the Kazakhstan case. And I think the question that's applicable to the North Korean case is, would those US security guarantees meant the same thing to the apartheid government as it did to the democratic government? And I think that's really still the key with North Korea, is that we can talk about security guarantees for North Korea, but there's no trust there. And there's still a clash of values between North Korea and the US that, you know, I think still causes, still is a source of mistrust, where, you know, until you get to a point where you've built that trust, so that North Korea can make those decisions and be confident in those decisions and confident in the idea that the US can secure, you know, that they can trust the US. I think that, you know, we can still come up with a lot of examples about denuclearization that are still pretty far out and pretty wish list examples. So I think I'll stop there, and I look forward to the discussion, and thank all the other speakers for their contributions.
Thank you very much. We're going to start a discussion now. So I have seen that we already have a couple of questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A function that you can find towards the bottom of your screens. I'm going to start with a couple of questions to the speakers, though. And Hoyun, I think we're going to begin with you, because I mean, you did mention the relationship with Kazakhstan, which I think is the one that attracts most interest when it comes to North Korea and Central Asia, or the Koreas and Central Asia, actually. And I wanted to ask if you can dig a bit deeper. You mentioned investment, which I found very interesting. North Korea seeking investment from the region, and the trade relationship, economic relationship between Kazakhstan in this case and North Korea. Can you explain us a bit more? What does this consist of, this economic relationship between the two of them?
Okay, so economic relations with between North Korea and Kazakhstan. Am I right about the question?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Yes. So as I mentioned earlier, the key factor that makes North Korea seeking investment from Kazakhstan or Central Asia is not at the official level. Well, this is more about like individual level or company level investment in North Korea, because they believe that the ethnic Koreans in the region could be, since it was already, it could be a strong connection point for North Koreans. Also, those Korean ethnics or Soviet Koreans made a lot of the successful stories in their business and their economic contributions in the region. So they work their companies in many different areas, like a manufacturer and energy industries. So I think North Korean government and North Korean authorities see those Soviet Koreans as a possible sources to reconnect and then attract more investments. But again, this is also comes with some risk or fragility because of the lack of the trust at the official level, given this North Korea is facing a lot of international pressures and sanctions, and those individuals are not likely to take a risk to go ahead and invest in North Korea. And what was the other question?
No, I think that was it for this round, actually. And it's interesting that you mentioned sanctions, because you are not the first person to mention sanctions in North Korean relations with other parts of the world. And I think this is an issue we're going to be getting back to later on today. But now I wanted to move to Camilo, because you indicated, and obviously you're based in Chile, actually. So it would be interesting to learn more about the relationship between this country and North Korea, right? Especially considering that Chile, the history of Chile is fascinating in and by itself, right? But in terms of relations with North Korea, it must be even more fascinating. So if you can please dig a bit deeper in this relationship between North Korea and Chile.
Okay, well, Ramon, thank you for the question. I was hoping to dig deeper during this second intervention. So, wait a minute, I was not prepared, sorry. Okay, so why Chile? In 1958, a year before the Cuban Revolution, a delegation from the DPRK traveled to Chile and had a meeting with the Federation of Trade Unions. This might seem like a casual exchange, but it had lasting repercussions. The secretary of the Trade Union Federation, Fernando Murillo Viaña, developed a strong connection with the DPRK and founded the Korean Friendship Association in Chile that year. This association became a Korean Cultural Institute in 1962 with the help of Carlos Morales Abarzúa, a Chilean congressperson. These two men played a key role in the development of North Korea and Chile relations, while the former became the Chilean ambassador to North Korea in 1972. The latter led the first congressional delegation to visit Asia when they traveled to Pyongyang in 1965. But why were Chileans attracted to North Korea? During the Cold War, Latin America occupied a very ambiguous place, being both part of the Western Hemisphere under the influence of the United States, but also an underdeveloped region. Latin Americans understood the region's underdevelopment as the consequence of imperial exploitation and dependence on foreign capital. Thus, North Korea's ability to rebuild itself from the ashes of the Korean War and its emphasis on self-reliance were clearly attractive to Latin Americans. But what is even more interesting is that the people who established close ties with the DPRK also supported other third world nations. Fernando Murillo Viaña, a journalist, wrote several articles in support of the Algerian people, and the president of the Korean Cultural Institute, Carlos Morales Abarzúa, was also a member of the Chinese Cultural Center. So how can we understand this third worldism? The Latin American republics, despite their dependent development and economic backwardness, have almost the same republican trajectory as the United States. This led to a proud stance that understood third worldism as a sensitivity towards the newly decolonized countries. It was the duty of Latin Americans to help African and Asian countries in their colonial struggles, as they could relate to their problems based on their historical experiences. And what about North Korea? Why Chile? First, Chile was a member of the UN Commission for the Unification and Rehabilitation of Korea, UNCORC. One of North Korea's main diplomatic objectives was to dissolve this organization. From a North Korean perspective, this UN body was a diplomatic tool for US imperialism, something that is close to being true, as the US chose its members and thought they would align themselves with the American foreign policy. After diplomatic exchanges with North Korea during the early 1960s, Chile withdrew from this UN body in 1966. However, and due to pressure from both South Korea and the United States, Chile reconsidered its decision and rejoined the UN Commission, only to withdraw permanently in 1970 after the presidential election that saw Salvador Allende become the first Marxist to be elected president in a liberal democracy in Latin America. Second, my archival work and recent studies show that the eternal friendship between Cuba and North Korea had plenty of high and low moments. Not only did North Korea fail to pay its debts, but Cuban diplomats in Pyongyang also suffered racial discrimination. This is something I'm currently researching, but it seems that the DPRK wanted to open a second base in Latin America in case its relations with Cuba deteriorated. However, Those plans were cut short with the defeat of revolutionary projects at the hands of US-backed dictators during the 70s and 80s. And moving to contemporary issues, with the return to democracy in the early 90s, this allowed for a rapprochement between Chile and the DPRK. Interviews with politicians who traveled to Pyongyang revealed that Chile was committed to opening this isolated country. But behind those words, Chile had other interests. The leader of the German Diplomatic Republic, Erich Honecker, sought asylum in the Chilean embassy in Moscow after German reunification. His presence quickly became uncomfortable, and one way to deal with it, according to declassified documents, was to send him to the DPRK, as Kim Il-sung was keen to offer him asylum. However, this did not work, and Honecker was extradited to Germany in 1992. More recently, in 2011, the young communist and student movement leader, Camila Vallejo, criticized her own party for sending letters of condolence to the North Korean regime after Kim Jong-il's death. And here I quote, "I believe it was not appropriate, but I also think that there has been a media exploitation because the party always sends letters of condolence." But why was it inappropriate? The Chilean opposition to the Pinochet dictatorship in the late 1980s made human rights its banner of struggle. Therefore, supporting a regime widely known for its violation of human rights was clearly a contradiction. Finally, jumping to 2017 and during the North Korea's sixth nuclear test, US Vice President Mike Pence urged Latin American republics to isolate North Korea. However, Chile refused to comply and affirmed that it will maintain its relations. And I believe that this episode sums up the current situation quite well. Although Chile does not support the North Korean regime and joins the international community in condemning the progress of its nuclear program, the link between the two nations have a symbolic dimension that reinforces Chile's autonomy. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's interesting that you mentioned that the human rights issue affects relations between, in this case, Chile and North Korea, because we always talk about how this might be instrumentalized, as some people say, you know, by the US, maybe by other countries as well. But here you have an example of a country in which this actually really matters, right? And to the identity of many people in the country as well. We're going to move to Virginie now, because we want to discuss the relationship with Uganda that you have indicated is multifaceted in the past, right? So can you dig deeper in this relationship between Uganda on the one hand and North Korea on the other hand?
Yes, sure. So just as I'm starting this, I just wanted to add something that I hadn't really talked about earlier. I mean, obviously, what we're talking about when we are considering Africa is, well, actually, we can consider Africa by itself. You know, we are talking about 50 countries that are very different, that are, you know, that have their own language, their own culture, their own past history. So focusing on a few selects, I think is quite helpful. But I just want to make sure that, you know, I wasn't putting every country in the same bag, because I can hear, you know, the African specialists who are going to be saying that you can't quite do it this way. So I just wanted to say that. So I think the relationship with Uganda, I mean, it's quite interesting because it ticks really a lot of the boxes when it comes to the evidence that we can have around, you know, the strengths of the relationship. So when we are trying to find evidence, you know, go back to some of what the panelists were talking about, how do you know that something is really happening? Where we can look obviously at historic data. We have a lot of, you know, historic documents available via, you know, the Wilson Center that really trace some of those relationships, and especially the beginning of the relationship with Uganda. And then after that, we can obviously have a look at the North Korean data by itself and how North Korea talks about its own relationship with the rest of the world. So, you know, during my spare nights, you know, I've coded for a lot of those relationships, you know, looking at KCNA archives since, you know, over the past 20 years, basically, and then looking at the volume and looking at actually, you know, what it is that North Korea is really talking about. This is just sending, you know, a condolence notice, or is this actually talking much more in depth about some of the project and all of that? And with Uganda, that's what we have. We can also cross-check the data with, what happens on the Ugandan side as well, how they talk about the relationship, what is public, what are the types of photos of leaders meeting that are available, and also about, in quantifying terms, trade data, stuff being, brought, back and forth, weapons also being sold. So we have access to all of that. So when it comes to the relationship, what's quite interesting is it's a very extensive relationship. It's been going on for 40 years, plus. But in late 2017, Uganda actually said that it would terminate severe its relationship with the DPRK in light of the round of sanctions. So it's a question, I think we'll probably go back to this, is this really the case, that those relationships have fizzled, just like, the relationship with Nigeria. I think I saw on the chat, that some people were asking about the other areas, in Africa, and there's Nigeria, there's, Angola, this is quite important, South Africa, and a few others. So the relationship was quite important because it was really about, in a way, the DPRK being to some extent a dominant partner, or a partner with, a bit more of a comparative advantage, sending military advisors, sending weapons, in some cases actually delaying a repayment debt that Uganda had in a number of times. So we can see, those kind of financial aspects. But there were also personal relationships that went quite deep. So, the Ugandan president, Museveni, who has been in power since 1986, essentially has spanned, the three North Korean, leaders in its relationship, and is said to have said that, Korean friends who have helped us, over time. So there's really this sense of a personal relationship as well. So what's quite interesting in terms of what has been done, the DPRK as early as 1975 trained Ugandan in its military academy. It built a munition factory in Uganda as well. There were quite a lot of education exchange, and essentially the DPRK was doing this for money, for hard currency as well, which goes back to what Jenny was talking about. Essentially trying to get money and have those relationships and those little amount of money that then do create a somewhat functional budget, and especially when you are at a point where you don't really have the Soviet Union anymore. You have China, but and then you don't have a lot of friends because you are labeled a rogue state and all of that. Who are you going to talk with? Well, you're going to talk to the others who have difficulties talking with the rest of the world, perhaps. So we are talking about that type of relationship as well. I think what's quite interesting is something that is emerging as well in some of the data, and that's the role of China in there, because it seems that in some cases those things were not necessarily facilitated by China, but China assisted in some things, and this has been known since the 1990s, essentially, with Chinese and North Korean military specialists working together with armed factories. So there's a question of the role of China in there in assisting North Korean ventures abroad. So I think I'll just stop here. It's quite an extensive relationship, and I think the jury is still out as to what's going to happen in terms of whether Uganda will completely terminate its relationship. It seems that it has taken steps towards doing this, but it's a bit unclear still.
Thanks for the description of the relationship between Uganda and North Korea, and for reminding us that we're covering different regions, but every country in these regions, of course, is different. Something we shouldn't forget. I have one more question for Jenny, and then I think we'll move to the Q&A with the audience, because we have already 6-7 questions coming our way. And Jenny, you pointed out a very interesting idea, which is that North Korea can come back in terms of having relations with countries with which it seems that at some point they're breaking down. The example that is always given, of course, is with many Central Eastern European states, 1980s, 1990s, a breakdown in relations when they move away from communism. But then obviously some of them then strengthen their relations with North Korea. Again, can you explain a bit more about this idea that you have described, about how relations with North Korea don't necessarily stop at some point to never come back, but they can resume? What are the factors behind it? Why does this happen? And what does this tell us about North Korea as an international actor?
Yeah, I think, that it's a matter of pragmatism. As Virginia was saying, that this idea that, at some point, who is North Korea going to trade with? So when they're cut off from all, when they're cut off from so much of the international financial systems and through sanctions and through formal countries, I think, in the old days, in the 1950s, as several of our speakers have talked about, North Korea was sort of this beacon of, they were freedom fighters and they were the stronger Korea, because pre-division of the country, the North was the industrialized part of the country, the South was agrarian. And so, they had the economic infrastructure, and for the first few years, especially with Soviet assistance, they were leaps and bounds ahead of the South. That obviously changed and relatively quickly. But at the same time, this was their identity, was that they were fighting imperialism, they were fighting colonialism, and they were fighting outside occupation. And I think, in some respects, obviously in that time, they had those patronages around the world that identified with either sort of the anti-colonial aspects of the relationship or of the messaging of the identity that they were creating, or the, shared communist ties, shared socialist ties. These days, I think North Korea has become somewhat the champion of the underdogs. So you have a system where you have big power competition, and you have, the big powers exercising influence over, states. In some cases, they've overthrown governments. In some cases, they've used economic coercion. So I think there's now a sense, especially after the Singapore summit, it did validate North Korea as a legitimate power, and it did sort of create a sense that that they were doing things their own way and that they could be successful doing things their own way. So I think, for the North Koreans, there was this sense of competition in the past with South Korea, where you had to choose sides. You couldn't be friends with both. And if you were friends with North Korea first and then, created relations with South Korea, the North Koreans were insulted by this, because they were the legitimate Korea. I think these days, they're much more pragmatic about those relationships. And so it's now about, well, if you're willing to work with me still, despite the international sanctions in place, despite the international community's condemnation of the way that they've gone about doing things, they're more than willing to work with them, and forgive the past and move on and move forward, as long as there's tangible benefits there for them to reap.
Look forward and the tangible benefits, very important points actually that you make there, and we sometimes forget when we look at North Korea from a very ideological perspective, really. That has its own pragmatic interest like any other country. I'm going to move on to the questions from the audience. And the first one that we have, I guess, Hoyun, would be for you, because it relates to Turkmenistan, actually. And Keith Bennett is asking whether you have any comments on this relationship between Turkmenistan and North Korea. And he reminds us that Foreign Minister Lee Yong-ho visited the country a few years ago.
Yes, thank you for the question. Well, everyone thinks that Turkmenistan and North Korea are quite similar in many ways. It's one of the most closed state system in the world, and little is known to the entire world about what's going on inside. Lee visited Turkmenistan in 2018 en route to Russia. So at the time, I think it was about the non-alignment movement meeting in Azerbaijan. So I had to search it up and what happened. But so I think we can say about many things, but I have at least 3 points about the relationship between North Korea and Turkmenistan. And the first thing is about Russia. So Russia is the only country among the CIS states that maintain an active relationship with North Korea. So they still have their operational North Korean embassy in Moscow, and they have many exchanges. And before the sanctions getting severe, a lot of the North Korean workers were actually working in Russia. In this sense, Turkmenistan has also strong tie with Russia. So for North Korea, it is very strategic decision and necessary decision to connect with Turkmenistan, at least to keep the fire on for its relationship with the region, Central Asia and or CIS in a broader sense. And the second point is that, well, Turkmenistan is also against the US-led world order. So it's kind of I can say maverick or deviation against this US ruled system. And all the sanctions or the pressure on North Korea is not pretty well, complied by countries like Turkmenistan. So it's also a target of US sanction. So in that way, well, enemy of my enemies, my friends, that similar logic Jenny mentioned a second ago can be also, we can think of. So for North Korean leaders and elites, if they have to find some foreign partners, foreign countries they can work with on, then Turkmenistan shares certain values, if we can call dictatorship as a value, and also has a common enemy and also has a strong connection with Russia. And lastly, it's also about the actual material demands of North Korea. So when Ri Yong-ho visited Turkmenistan, it was also part of a visit to Russia and Azerbaijan, which was, I heard, it's mainly about the cooperation in energy and some trade. So North Korea needs someone, trade partners and external sources for their energy demands as well. So given that all other major energy exporting countries are not willing to break the international solidarity of sanction against North Korea, so the Turkmenistan might be a reasonable alternative to meet this pragmatic demands of North Korea. So that's what I see the relationship between two countries.
Thanks. That's interesting. I think that the four of you have already mentioned that one of the reasons between a strong relations between North Korea and other countries is actually the common enemies, so to speak, right? The fact that they side with each other, because somehow, in the case of some countries, they are isolated by the US or by other countries as well. So you see a clear effect there from the way these countries are treated, maybe by the international community. We have a question now by Tibor Mesey, which I guess is both for Virginia and Camilo, actually, which is if you can tell us the specific countries in Africa and Latin America with which North Korea has particularly close relations, close cooperation. Virginia, maybe we can begin with you. Which countries in the region that you're covering, right, in Sub-Saharan Africa, do you think North Korea has developed the strongest relations with so far?
So I mean, we talked about Uganda. Egypt is very important because of the size of the investment as well. I mean, Noor has come developing the the 3G network in Korea and all of that. So from an infrastructure point of view, you've got countries that have where you have an embassy in North Korea and then an embassy in the country, and that's just Egypt and Nigeria. That are the two that have this kind of dual relationship. Libya comes across when we look at Africa, but that's a little bit of a specific case as well. But in terms of the other countries that are really important, it's going to be Ethiopia, it's Angola, it's Congo as well, because you have arms sales, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Uganda, and Tanzania. And I think I was just looking at the question as well, and I'll just address the point from I think Whitney Thomas, who was just asking about Côte d'Ivoire, because that's the reverse of the question. Actually, there's very little actually around the former African colonies. So you have out of those 50 or so African countries, you've got probably about 20 that are the ones that the DPRK is involved with, and then you have somewhere you have sporadic relations, and then somewhere a good patch of around 20 where there's no embassy and little to no interaction. So Côte d'Ivoire is actually in there. You have an official relationship that started in 1974, but you have other countries, Senegal as well, 1972. You've got Morocco, 18. Cameroon is probably the one which has the most interaction of the former French colonies.
Thanks, and thanks for taking on that question as well. That was from Whitney Thomas, which indeed was asking about the relationship with North Korea. And now, Camilo, what about Latin America? Which countries would you say have developed or today have stronger links with North Korea in the region?
Well, the two countries that have the strongest links with North Korea are both Cuba and Venezuela. And of course, this has a lot to do with the fact that they also have faced economic sanctions. So the one way to cope with is to actually show solidarity and to cooperate between among them. So I will say that those are the two countries that are the most representative. But a third country that's very important is Brazil, because Brazil is a country that's traditionally considered a close ally to the United States, but it has a North Korean embassy in its country, and they also have one embassy in Pyongyang. So I will say that Brazil is the third important country in the region.
And actually, since you touched on Venezuela and Cuba, we actually have a specific question on these two countries from Dr. Satoru Miyamoto at the Seiga Queen University in Japan. Can you expand a bit more, because he's actually working on the relationship between North Korea and these two countries, Cuba and Venezuela. So if you can expand a bit more on other than being under US sanctions, as you have mentioned, other aspects that are important in the relationship between North Korea on the one hand and the two of them on the other hand? Okay, so first about Cuba, it's important that when they established the bilateral relations in 1960, Che Guevara visited Pyongyang, and Che Guevara in North Korea became like some sort of model of what a revolutionary should be. So there is an important shared history between North Korea and Cuba. Also, Cuba was one of the few countries that joined North Korea in boycotting the Seoul Olympic Games. And more recently, in 2013, I believe that there was this ship that was caught in the Panama Canal that was carrying 100,000 AK-45, I don't know, but it was rifles that were supposed to be delivered to North Korea, repaired and sent back to Cuba. And those arms, those guns were put into sugar. I don't know. They were kind of passing those guns through the Panama Canal, but they were cut. And about Venezuela, it's interesting that during the Chavez administration, Nicolás Maduro, he was foreign minister, and during that time he publicly condemned the North Korea's nuclear program. But now that he's in power, he's kind of strengthening the relations between North Korea and Venezuela. They established the Venezuelan embassy in North Korea in 2019, and I think this year, February, they had a meeting in Venezuela at the North Korean embassy, and they were
talking about strengthening their relation and their cooperation. So the Venezuelan case is really interesting because it shows what Jenny said about how North Korea can adapt to changes within one country. Yeah, that will be my answer.
Yeah, but thanks for zooming in. There is a question about Cuba, but I have this one for Hoyun, which I find very interesting, which is whether do you see any DPRK workers, labor in working in construction, in agriculture, or some other sector in Central Asia or in Kazakhstan? Have you come across this? Any workers in Kazakhstan, I guess? And if so, the second part of the question by Suji Sue, have they been repatriated?
Well, unfortunately, I didn't have many chance to travel Central Asian countries. I only traveled in Kazakhstan. So my answer might be pretty limited. Well, I didn't see any North Korean workers in Kazakhstan. The city I'm living in is Astana or Nur Sultan, the capital city, which has the most, a lot of constructions going on. So every year, every month, something new is building across the city. And there are a lot of foreign workers, usually from Central Asian countries and China, and sometimes Turkey, especially for more advanced, skilled technicians and so on. I met some Kazakhstan people who talk about North Korea. So back in 1990s, there were some North Korean workers, not just official representatives, some workers in Kazakhstan. There are, well, for those older generations who experienced Soviet times, North Korea is much familiar culturally and politically. But after 2000s, I don't think many North Koreans are actually allowed to work since the embassy was closed. About the repatriation, I don't think Kazakhstan has any case of forced repatriation of North Koreans. So I can't tell much about that. But years ago, I looked at the data showing that a lot of North Korean workers in Russia was sent back to North Korea because of the sanction. So I think that's all I can answer.
That is great. Thanks a lot. And I want to move to a question that I think, Jenny, you can tackle by Donald Kirk, who is asking about Kim Jong-un's emphasis on the need for economic reform rather than nuclear weapons and missiles, and how does this seeming shift can affect relations with countries with which North Korea is looking for trade relations. He also asked about North Korean exports of missiles and other military products.
Yeah, I mean, this was the whole point of, you know, when Kim Jong-un came to power, he had the Byungjin policy, which was the placing equal priority on the nuclear development and the economic development. But since 2017, when he declared that the state nuclear force was done, he's really moved to a everything for the economy state policy. So while they're still developing their military and nuclear weapons, the emphasis is really on economic development. I think there were clear signs in the Party Congress and especially in several of the speeches that Kim Jong-un has made in the past couple of years that, you know, if there isn't that there's very low expectations that relations are going to change with the US and South Korea anytime soon that will bring about the kind of sanctions relief that would allow them to really expand their legal trade and trade efforts. And I think what you see then instead is, a real focus on internal reform, creating an economy that's more resilient to a persistent sanctions environment. And as such, I think you see a lot of their foreign policy is shifting as well. rather than spending as much time and energy trying to cultivate, trying to change the minds of stubborn states like the US and South Korea, where the bar is very high and any kind of traction is going to take a very long time to get. I think you see them spending a lot of time cultivating sympathetic states. So like Venezuela, Syria, Vietnam, and you see a lot of signs and a lot of countries that North Korea has expressed solidarity with, even in international forums, like at their last UN General Assembly speech, where they mentioned, I think, China, Russia, Cuba, and Palestine. And so you do see a lot of effort coming from Kim Jong-un. There's a constant stream of congratulatory letters and exchanges with foreign leaders. You have seen pre-pandemic, real influx of a real movement of diplomats into, again, non-six party states to really cultivate those relationships. You see very active relations where they do have embassies, where their diplomatic staff are still very active, in their communities and trying to explore what different options there are. And I think you've even been involved in track 2 meetings in Europe of like, what are the economic opportunities if certain conditions were to change, in order to plan for, what could come and see where their options lie. But, since 2018, especially, you have seen North Korea really try to formalize some of these relationships, like, signing, like establishing the diplomatic ties with Venezuela and opening the embassy. You see them signing, economic and military cooperation agreements with Syria, with I think at one point even Mexico and a number of other states. I like that Camilo had mentioned Brazil, and there was actually one exchange where one Brazilian mayor had awarded Kim Jong-un with a hero award for his resistance to sanctions. So you do see a lot of this foreign policy, and certainly as a part of that, if they can't do, more legal trade, where that's becoming ever more difficult, the small arms missiles and other technologies are going to be on the docket as well, in terms of what are high value assets that North Korea has that they can sell. And so it is, a proliferation risk that has to be monitored closely.
Yeah, thanks for that. And it's interesting because it also caught my attention what you mentioned, the point about Brazil, actually, right? Which is obviously the biggest democracy in Latin America in terms of population, right? And there we go. It has a strong relations with North Korea. So I think we have time for one last question. I'm afraid we won't be able to answer all of them. You can, of course, contact the speakers. Their emails are publicly available, so I'm volunteering them. If you have any more questions, you can drop them a line. But there's this question looking into the present, which I found quite interesting, by Porcodi Ganespandian, who is asking about Africa and Latin America, actually. So Virginia and Camilo, can you tell us about the effects, any effects that you have seen from the pandemic and even from the Biden administration in relations between North Korea and Latin America and Africa? Virginia, if you want to go first.
I don't have really evidence of this. I have to say, over the past the past year. So I'm not really able to comment, since the PRK has kind of closed. When it comes to the Biden, I think this is going to be a tough a tough sell for the Biden administration to top what happened with the Trump administration. But I'll just go back to, because I was in North Korea actually 2 years ago, just on this date actually, and when Donald Trump was still president, and had quite a lot of frank discussion with people actually about the United States and about this 180, and what it means, to engage with with the United States, and you know, one person told me, well, you know, they are just, you know, he's just a buffoon, basically. We don't buy it. We just, you know, you know, there was no, you know, that smoke didn't, you know, really, you know, I think it was perhaps just maybe in Donald Trump's mind that it was working, but from that point of view, in the DPRK, it wasn't really going to change much. So I'll let hopefully Camilo has more insight than me when it comes to your question.
Camilo, what about Latin America? Any effects from the pandemic or even Biden?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have as much information, but the only thing I know is that Cuba has a cooperation agreement on health with North Korea. I don't know if they have dispatched people to North Korea, but what they're still doing is training medical students from North Korea. That's something that I know they're still doing. But yes, the pandemic is hitting really hard Latin America, so we don't have the time to start thinking about North Korea. We just keep getting the same news about North Korea. They banned pets, they're giving it as meat to the butchers, and thus really crazy news. But other than that, there's no additional information. Just the developments with Venezuela, they're still working, and you can even find photos of this year February meeting they had where they're wearing masks. So it's important that they're still cooperating, but yeah, I don't have as much information. I'm sorry about that.
No, but that's very useful. And actually, you touched on the question by James Park, who was asking about Cuba, North Korea health cooperation. We have to leave it there. I want to thank, of course, all the speakers for joining us today and for their insights. I found this a fascinating discussion, and I actually learned quite a lot throughout the hour plus we have had the discussion. So on behalf of the KF-VUB Korea Chair and the Brussels School of Governance, thank you very much for joining us. And Jenny, I'll leave it to you to close the event on behalf of Stimson and 38 North. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Ramon, and thanks for your moderating today. It was a great discussion, and thanks to all of our speakers for joining us on behalf of the Stimson Center and 38 North. And we hope our audience will join us for future events. Thank you.